woken up in a cold sweat because you were having a traumatic dream? Maybe we'll call it a nightmare. Maybe in your dream you were wading through quicksand and slowly sinking, and you tried to shout for help, but no sound was coming out of your mouth. Or maybe you were being chased through a forest by an axe murderer, or worse still, you were running through the town centre totally naked. For some unexplainable reason, you didn't get dressed before leaving home. But then dreams don't often deliver explanations. And then you wake up, you come to your senses, you take a deep breath, a sip of water, and realise it's not happening. It's not true. You haven't run for anywhere for years. I had a troublesome dream not long ago, and when I woke up in a cold sweat, I took a deep breath, a sip of water, and realised the dream was actually true, and almost as traumatic as some of those other dreams I just mentioned. It all happened some 46 years ago. I was a student at university in Cardiff, and I did something I can now talk about, but which caused me so much embarrassment at the time. I'll tell you about it, but promise not to laugh. At least don't laugh too loudly. I just become a science student at Cardiff University, and along with other members of the class, I was required to give a 10-minute presentation in front of the camera to the rest of the class. Well, in those days, I suppose that was quite cutting edge. These days, we are all tech savvy and are happy to video ourselves on our mobile phones, much like I'm doing now. And then in front of a class of fellow students, that was very different. It was a scary prospect indeed. We were permitted to speak on any subject we desired. And as a fairly new Christian, I thought I would turn this into a full-on evangelistic meeting. I had lots of passion, but zero wisdom. My audience was sitting ducks. Looking back, it wasn't my best hour. As in those days, I was a bit of a fundamentalist who thought that a bit of hellfire preaching would do them no harm at all. I even envisaged myself, just catch this, I envisaged myself after the event being invited to go from place to place, sharing my testimony of how students and lecturers came to faith through my obedience to God. I know, it's embarrassing. My toes are curling even as I speak about it. Worse still, I'd been reading some awful dispensationalist material in an American paperback book on the second coming of Christ. It was a kind of forerunner to the Left Behind series of books. You know, the kind of genre that I'm talking about here. I call it Christian fairy tale. I think it would be fair to say that the class didn't fall on their knees in deep repentance. They just laughed. They laughed very loudly. I can still see the lecturers doing their best to keep a straight face as I got redder and redder in the face, and all I wanted was the second coming to happen that second. It was awful. I deserved everything I got in that lecture room that day. My audience was merciless. And I know it's unlikely, but should you ever meet anyone who was there at the day, please do inform them that fresh-faced 18-year-old has since become a lot more normal. But then again, I suppose everything is relative. As a newly converted 18-year-old, I had a lot of bottle, even if I was a bit deficient in the wisdom department. Well, looking back with a few more decades under my belt, I acknowledge that I was foolish, very foolish, and I hope that my lack of wisdom didn't put my listeners off Jesus forever. Over the years, I've learned many lessons, and one of those lessons is about being foolish for Jesus, which actually is quite different to being plain foolish, as I was on that day 46 years ago. You might think of being foolish for Jesus as a rather strange concept, but I didn't come up with the idea. St. Paul beat me to it by about 2,000 years. In fact, that phrase is a phrase that he uses, fools for Christ, and it's found in 1 Corinthians. The Corinthians was a church that had a love affair with problems, and the Corinthian pastor or pastors certainly needed a medal. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul informs the church of one of their faults, and the fault that he mentions, first of all, was the fact that they were divided. And the issue that divided them was that there were groups within the church who were bigging up the various human leaders. And some of the congregation preferred Pastor Paul, others it was Pastor Peter, and still others Pastor Apollos, and the real spiritual ones claimed to be followers of Christ. Now Paul was having none of it, and he spends best part of 4 chapters putting them straight on the matter. 4 chapters on, he emphasizes that he and Apollos were only servants. They had nothing to boast about. So you people in Corinth, please stop all this boasting. Grow up. Stop being so spiritually immature. That was essentially his message. All their boasting about human leaders was a symptom of a much deeper problem. And that problem was that they thought that they were so wise. But Paul spoke about God's wisdom being the very opposite of the world's wisdom. And in God's wisdom, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. In God's kingdom, we are called to be servants and we are called to be fools for Christ. The word fool in the New Testament Greek, and the word that Paul uses, is the word moros, from which we get the word moron or moronic. A fool is someone who lacks wisdom or judgment or common sense. But in the kingdom of God, God's values are always the other way around, upside down, the antithesis of society's standards. So whether it's morons for the Messiah or fools for Christ, what might that mean for us? And in which way are we to become fools for Christ? Well, Paul has a lot to say about foolishness, especially in the first chapter of 1 Corinthians, which is one of the great chapters of the New Testament. So let's try to unpack what's being said there and what being a fool for Christ actually means. As fools for Christ, we have, firstly, a foolish message. The citizens of Corinth, wisdom was everything for them. They boasted of their great philosophers and learning, and they were proud of their sophistication and culture, their art and their music and literature and the Greek language. And Paul challenged this thirst for knowledge and academic and cultural pride with the Christian message. It is a message which is utterly foolish, at least in the eyes of the world. And Paul makes no apology for that. The Christian message is focused on Christ. And think about our message for a moment. At one level, it's incredibly foolish, or so it appears. It is centered on Christ. One Yale historian wrote these words of Jesus. He was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another village where he worked in a carpenter's shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family or owned a house. He didn't go to college. He never visited a big city. He never traveled more than 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of those things one usually associates with greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. He was nailed to a cross between 2 thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his clothing, the only property he had on earth. Well, this is the man we claim is the center of everything, the Jewish Messiah, the Son of God, the Savior of the world. And I hear not only those erudite scholars in the city of Corinth, but countless others down through the centuries saying, you must be kidding. How can Jesus be the one that you claim him to be? Who has heard of such nonsense? Well, Paul didn't compromise. In the first chapter of 1 Corinthians, he writes these words, Jews demand signs, Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles, but to those that God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. To the Jews, a crucified Messiah was a scandal. To the Greeks, it was utter foolishness. And yet this very message is the cornerstone of the Christian faith. The cross represents vulnerability and sacrifice and love. By embracing the cross, we are called to reject self-sufficiency and pride. Through the cross, we acknowledge our limitations, our need for grace, and our dependence on God. Well, 20 centuries have come and gone, and today he, Jesus, is the central figure of the human race. All the armies that have ever marched and the navies that have ever sailed, all the parliaments that have ever sat and the kings that have ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of man on earth as much as that one solitary life. As fools of Christ, we acknowledge he works through foolish messengers. That's my second point. Again, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul reminds us with these words that, brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. A couple of weeks ago, in a talk that I gave, I read to you of an exchange that took place between Origen, a 2nd century Christian leader, and Celsus, an atheist historian. Celsus attempts to belittle the Christian faith, and more specifically Christians themselves, by saying that most leaders choose the highest caliber of people to follow them, but you, a silly master, which is the way that he refers to Jesus, calls the least and the lowly in society to follow him. Those that Celsus called the rag, tag and bobtail of humanity. Well, on that occasion, a couple of weeks ago, I read to you Origen's reply, which is quite awesome. It's one of those game, set and match responses. I've got to read it again. He says, yes, they are the ragtag and bobtail of humanity, but Jesus does not leave them that way. Out of the material that you would have thrown away as useless, he fashions men, giving them back their self-respect, enabling them to stand on their feet and look God in the eyes. They were cowed, cringing, broken things, but the Son has set them free. I remember the first time that this wonderful truth hit home to me. It was in a school hall on the outskirts of Cardiff, one Tuesday evening, early 1990. Julie and I were planting a new church on a very rough, tough housing estate. Following the meeting, the school caretaker who arrived to close the school following the meeting made some very derogatory remarks about some of the people that we had in our church at the time. People with learning disabilities, those who were on the margins of society, people who were quite poor and bedraggled, though the man didn't phrase his observations quite as politely as I just did. Your church seems to attract them, he said sneeringly. I responded, society turns such people away. Their reaction is just like yours. But the reason that we gather people that you would call odd is that they know that in our church they will find love and acceptance. The world at large might pile them on the garbage heap, but we don't. They're precious to us because they are precious to God. Well, this guy was a bit of a tough guy, and he walked away with tears in his eyes. I have no idea why that remark touched something quite deeply within him, or what God was beginning to do in his heart at that time. But it was one of those occasions when I sensed God provide me with an answer that was beyond my own wisdom. God does not call the equipped. He equips the called. And I thank God that he uses the improbable, the unqualified, the ragtag and bobtail of humanity, or in the words of that school caretaker, those who might appear to be a bit odd in the eyes of the world, to reveal his glory and to bring honour to his name. Then thirdly, there are the foolish methods. I'm not sure if there is a better word than methods, but what I'm talking about is God's ways in this world, those principles and values which help define God's people. We often refer to them as principles of his kingdom. The ways, the standards, the ethics, the values of God appear foolish to those who don't embrace Christ. Take, for example, the so-called Beatitudes, those blessed sayings of Jesus. They're the very opposite, the antithesis of worldly values. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Ours is a dog-eat-dog world. It's survival of the fittest. The one with the most toys wins. Get to the top, never mind who you stand on or walk over to get there. But the values of God's kingdom focus on humility and servant-heartedness and forgiveness and love. The ways of the world focus on gaining reputation. But we serve Christ, who had no reputation and willingly made himself nothing and became a servant, being made in human likeness. He is the one who humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. We're called to values that are so different to the ways of the world. In God's kingdom, the first will be last and the last will be first. In God's kingdom, generosity is highly valued, sharing our time, our finances, and our lives to serve others, radiating kindness and compassion and grace and mercy as we do. God's kingdom promotes forgiveness of others, forgiving others who have wronged us, forgiving them in the way that we ourselves have been forgiven. God's kingdom endorses sacrificial love, not just for our friends, but for our enemies too. In the eyes of a watching world, this makes little sense. The message of Christ, the messengers of Christ, the methods of Christ, they would say sheer nonsense, utter foolishness. C.S. Lewis, professor of English literature at both Oxford and Cambridge universities, famous author, wrote, "If you read history, you will find out that the Christians who did the most for the present world were precisely those who thought most of the next. Aim at heaven and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you will get neither." Another concept that's regarded as foolish. We are called to be fools for Christ, and being a fool for Christ will on occasions mean that we move out of our comfort zones. There have been many occasions when I dared to do things that potentially could have blown up in my face and made me look very foolish in the extreme. But as we said a few weeks back in our series, you're not going to walk on water unless you get out of the boat. I'd like to finish with a story that I hope encourages you, but it's a story in which I feel quite vulnerable in telling you. It's an occasion when I got it right. I much prefer to tell stories about my mistakes or my lack of faith or my foolishness as I did earlier. But on this occasion, I think I got things right. And I tell you this story to encourage you and also to praise God, who is simply quite awesome. It was 2002. I spoke at an annual conference hosted by the Elim Church. I was asked to do a seminar on community outreach, and following my talk, Lyndon Bowring, the Executive Director of CARE, a Christian organisation who does a great work in London, spoke with me. He was very encouraged by what I said. I informed Lyndon that we were planning a further expansion of our church and charity to add extra office space, an industrial kitchen to serve and feed the elderly, a new annex, a 64-place day nursery, and we wanted to double the size of our church auditorium. Well, Lyndon was massively encouraging, as he always is. I thought I'd strike when the iron was hot, and I asked him to speak at the opening event when eventually we would build the buildings. I explained that we had no money. We had up to 5 years to get the work started. The costs were going to be well in excess of £500,000. I also explained that we didn't have any money saved up and that our congregation wasn't especially wealthy and that he didn't need to cancel his holidays that year. But one afternoon in June 2002, I sat in my office contemplating prayerfully over the future of our church extension when I was reminded of the story of the Levites who were tasked with carrying the Ark of the Covenant from the desert where they'd been encamped for 40 years into the land that God had promised them as a nation. To get to that place of inheritance, they needed to get past the flooded River Jordan. We are told in Joshua chapter 3 that as soon as they placed their feet in the Jordan, the waters parted, just as the Red Sea had parted 40 years previously when the Israelites escaped from the Egyptians. The lesson I believe that God was teaching me was that the Levitical priests in faith needed to place their feet in the waters before they parted. It's a little bit like those electric supermarket doors that open only when you walk close enough to the sensor. If you stand back, the doors will remain closed. I immediately knew what this image of the Levites was all about. The Lord was showing me that I needed to move forward, to take some action before I would see the fulfillment of the vision. I also knew, I just knew what I was required to do. I cannot say that I often get these special moments of revelation. I probably can count on one hand the occasions when I have been given some clear supernatural revelation in this manner in over 45 years of following Jesus. But on this occasion, I believe that I heard from God. So what was he requiring me to do? Well, wait for it. And if you've not heard this story before, you're going to love this. I believe that he was wanting me to make contact with Lyndon again and ask if he would provide me a date for speaking at the grand opening of our church and community buildings the following year. That is mid-2003. Well, let's just stop there for a moment. It was already June 2002, and the project was going to cost, I believed at the time, a massive 500,000. It actually was closer to 800,000. I knew that if I had got this wrong, then I was going to be looking very, very foolish indeed. This potentially could have made me look considerably more foolish than the occasion when I was a fairly young Christian in Cardiff University. With a deep breath and a wavering trust in God, that this was from him, not from me, I wrote to Lyndon Bowring. Let me read a part of that letter that I wrote on the 26th of June 2002. Dear Lyndon, it was a pleasure to meet you at this year's Elim conference. Your words to me later that day were a great encouragement. Thank you. I know that much water has passed under the bridge since then, but I asked on that occasion if you would speak at an opening of an extension of our church and community facilities once built. You kindly agreed. We have received full planning permission for a 4-phase extension costing in the region of 500,000. This will provide us with a kitchen extension, extra office community rooms, a day nursery for 64 children, and an extension of 140 seats on our church building. Presently, we do not have any guaranteed finance. However, and I know this sounds extremely wacky, I believe that we can raise the finance and even finish the building by this time next year. With this in mind, would it be possible for you to provide me provisionally a Saturday and Sunday in May or June 2003? If this is okay with you, perhaps I could give you an update on things later in the year. At least by that time I'll know whether this strict timetable is feasible. If not, perhaps you would be willing to reschedule for later in the year. Lyndon, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for your ministry, which has been a significant blessing. Blah, 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 blah. There, I did it. The message was sent by snail mail. Well, 1 week later, Lyndon telephoned me to talk about my letter, saying that he would love to come to Tamworth and be our speaker in the grand opening of our church and community buildings. He got it. He knew that my correspondence was a step of faith, and he wanted to join me in that step of faith too. And we added a date to our diaries for May 2003. I thanked him and told him I'd be in touch, hopefully soon. What happened next was quite remarkable. Within a few weeks, we started receiving checks, big checks. Checks from trust funds and promises of money from central government, £10,000 one day, 56,000 another, 20,000, another 152,000, yet another 10,000 and yet another 56,000. In total, £440,000 was donated to us. Yes, I had worked jolly hard in writing applications, many weeks, topped 80 hours work, to many charitable foundations and to others whom I thought they might be able to help fund this mammoth project. But until that joint step of faith with Lyndon, we had not received a single penny. I've often thought about that time, and I can only explain it in terms of living under an open heaven. Something spiritual happened when Lyndon and I stepped into the flooded Jordan. The original date for the grand opening was moved back to actually May 2004, but that was not even slightly significant to us. The Lord was teaching us that once again, he is no man's debtor and remains faithful in all things. It's a remarkable story. I feel very vulnerable in telling it to you, but it is absolutely true, and to God be the glory. I was a fool for Christ on that day. But do you know what? The biggest fools of all are those who stay in the boat, those who never dare to exercise trust in Jesus. As I shared with you today, I often get things wrong, and you will too. But as William Carey, the father of modern missions, once said, expect great things from God and attempt great things for God. It's not a bad motto to live by. It really isn't.